Welcome to Yahoo Finance Sports Report, a unique look at the business of sports, brought to you by Yahoo Finance and Yahoo Sports. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano, and I'm here to coach you through the financial game. We'll look beyond the headlines, analyze all the latest sports news, the teams, trades, and billion-dollar deals, so you and your portfolio will win big. This week, we're talking about the Tampa Bay Lightning's new $1.8 billion sale, the growing impact of the New York Liberty on the WNBA, and why you should care about a snack that's become a favorite for Travis Kelce. Speaking of the NFL, we've got Andrew Brandt joining the show, a sports writer and executive who's going to discuss the NFL's international ambitions and so much more. Let's huddle up and get right into it. All right, everyone, it's time for Pomp's Playbook, where I take a look at some of the biggest headlines in sports this week that you and your portfolio need to know. Let's start with the Intuit Dome. The Intuit Dome is a new $2 billion home for the Los Angeles Clippers that was privately funded by former Microsoft CEO and Clippers owner Steve Ballmer. The Intuit Dome hosted its first game last week against the Phoenix Suns. Now, I do think it's quite important that this arena was built and funded by Steve Ballmer because there's so many sports venues today that are built using taxpayer money. But more importantly, the Intuit Dome has drawn rave reviews from attendees for its amenities and experience. Let me give you a few examples. First off, the Intuit Dome has over 1,100 toilets. You may laugh at that, but that means there's one toilet for every 15 seats and 3 times the NBA average. The Intuit Dome also has grab-and-go concession stands that use facial recognition technology for contactless checkout, helping fans get back to their seats as soon as possible so they don't miss any game action. There is also a double-sided 360-degree scoreboard the size of an acre, and the Intuit Dome even has heated seats with USB ports, massage settings, and built-in controllers so fans can play interactive games on the scoreboard during TV timeouts. But by far, my favorite part of the Intuit Dome is the wall. The wall is 51 rows of uninterrupted seating from the floor to the ceiling. There are no suites or tiers breaking it up, and fans can't cheer for the other team or even wear other opponent gear. But the best part about it is that season tickets for the wall only come out to $32 per game. In fact, the wall is such a fan favorite that Kevin Durant on the Suns praised it after last week's game. Even though he missed 2 free throws at the end of the game facing the wall because it was so incredibly loud, he called it incredible, talking about how other NBA owners should take notes from Steve Ballmer and build other venues like this. So things that I'm going to be watching out are twofold. Number one, are more NBA owners going to build student sections like the wall at the Intuit Dome? And number two, does this start a trend where more NBA owners are willing to privately fund their own NBA arenas to make sure that they get built in the way that they want them to be built? Next up, we're going to be talking about the Tampa Bay Lightning. For those of you who missed it, the Tampa Bay Lightning were recently sold at a $1.8 billion valuation. The team's current owner, Jeff Vinik, sold his more than 50% majority stake in the franchise to the co-CEOs of Blue Hour Capital. Now, the reason why this is so important, though, is because no one thought that Vinik would be selling the team. He's actually been quite popular as an owner because the team has performed so well. He bought the team in 2010, and they've made the playoffs 11 out of the last 14 years, even winning back-to-back Stanley Cups in 2020 and 2021. But I think the price was probably just too good to pass up. He bought the team in 2010 for $170 million, and he's now selling it at a $1.8 billion valuation, giving him a nearly 1,000% increase in his 14 years of ownership. You can't beat that. But the best part of this sale is unquestionably what Jeff Vinik decided to do afterwards, giving out $20 million in bonuses to the team's 300 employees. That's quite possibly life-changing money for some of them. Next up, let's talk about TKO buying PBR, On Location, and IMG from Endeavor. Now, I think this news shocked a lot of people last week because it kind of came out of left field, but it actually makes a lot of sense when you zoom out for a second and think about it in the big picture. Now, the headline will read that TKO Group, which is the publicly traded company and the owner that houses the UFC and WWE, is agreeing to purchase some assets, primarily professional bull riding or PBR, sports and entertainment agency IMG, and the hospitality company On Location from Endeavor. But I actually think there's a lot of synergies here that makes the deal a lot of sense. If you think about the 3 different companies, you have On Location, which already does a bunch of hospitality experiences for the UFC and WWE. Then you have IMG, which can help the UFC as they go negotiate their new media rights package over the next couple of years. And of course, you have PBR, which runs hundreds of live events every single year and can learn some lessons and do some synergies with the UFC and WWE. But ultimately, this is just sort of a transfer of assets. TKO owns these companies as as well. In fact, the two guys that run Endeavor run TKO, given Mark Shapiro and Ari Emanuel. So they're essentially just transferring some of these sports assets from Endeavor to TKO because Endeavor is being brought public by Silver Lake, the firm that controls the company today. So at the end of the day, this isn't really a big deal, but it should strengthen the balance sheet of a company like TKO and provide them with some synergies rather than selling these companies in the open market, which is what Endeavor will do with the other sports assets, namely tennis tournaments and other things like that. This week for the deeper dive, where I give you a play-by-play analysis of news in the sports world and its significance to your bottom line. We're going to be talking about the WNBA, and specifically what's going on with the New York Liberty. Now, many of you may not think about the New York Liberty as an underdog. I mean, sure, they obviously had the best record in the WNBA regular season this year, and they just won a WNBA championship. But they are an underdog, and I can explain why. If you think back a few years ago, the New York Liberty were left for dead. The team was owned by James Dolan, who owns the New York Knicks. And now James Dolan deserves a little bit of credit because he was the last remaining NBA owner who also owned a WNBA team since its founding in the late 1990s. But he was done with this team. I mean, the team had lost more than $100 million since its founding, and they weren't drawing huge crowds. So he put the team up for sale. Now, to do this, he tried to strengthen the position of the team and their balance sheet by moving the team out of Madison Square Garden, where they were playing their games in the heart of New York City, to Westchester County Center, right outside of New York. This is only about a 45-minute drive north of Madison Square Garden, but it's a significantly smaller venue, going from around 20,000 seats to just 2,000 or 3,000 seats. And it was sort of jarring to a lot of people because the facility was so old. The players were walking up 3 flights of stairs to go to the locker room, and many of them didn't even shower there because there quite literally weren't enough showers for them after the game. But this is where Joe and Clara Wu-Tsai came into play. They had just bought the Brooklyn Nets, the NBA team, and the Barclays Center in a deal worth a little bit more than $3 billion, so they bought the New York Liberty for about $15 million in 2019. And they immediately made a whole host of changes. Number one, they brought the team back from Westchester to Brooklyn to play in the Barclays Center, but they also did a bunch of other things too, like building out WNBA-specific locker rooms. They hired 8 full-time staff members on the performance side for the team, and they invested in the team. Now, this was super smart, of course, because there's a lot of synergies between the NBA team and a WNBA team. For instance, they're able to use their sponsorship staff to sell inventory that comes out on the WNBA side, but they can also help on the ticket sales side as well, because not only do they have the employees, but they have a laundry list of people who attended NBA games and bought season tickets, so they can reach out to those people and attempt to get them to buy WNBA tickets as well. But the big changes came a couple of years after that, when they really went on the attack in free agency. They flew from New York City to Turkey to talk to Breanna Stewart and convince her to join the team in free agency, but they also signed a bunch of other players too, like Jonquel Jones and Courtney Vandersloot, which they paired with Sabrina Ionescu, who was their former number 1 overall pick. This created a super team of sorts where they were able to now be at the top of the level in the WNBA. They didn't win the championship in their first year, but they won it this past year. And what we've seen is that this success and investment by the size has transformed the business of the Liberty. Their ticket sales have gone up more than 100% over the last year, and their season ticket sales have gone up more than 200% since the team moved back to Brooklyn. They've also seen a 150% increase year over year in game day merchandise sales, and we've seen 2 consecutive years of 30% increases in corporate sponsorships. The Liberty were also second in the WNBA this year in attendance, with an average of 12,730 fans per home game, which was second, of course, only to Caitlin Clark's Indiana Fever. And if you look at the WNBA finals specifically, they set a record in Game 5 with over 18,000 fans in attendance, which again was a record at the Barclays Center for the New York Liberty. They also had more than 2 million people watching that game at home, watching them close out the final before their ticker tape parade a few days later. Now, the reason why all of this is important, because if you think back to what I said at the beginning, the Size brought this team for $15 million in 2019, but they sold a minority stake in the team at a $200 million valuation earlier this year. Now, this isn't some pie-in-the-sky number. They quite literally sold a minority stake in the team that valued the franchise at $200 million. And they think this team can be worth much more. Sportico says they're doing a league-leading $18 million in revenue this past season, which is a pretty fair revenue multiple given the growth trajectory of this league. But Clara Wu-Tsai, who owns the team, says that she believes it could be worth more than $1 billion over the next 10 years. And I quite frankly think that she's probably right. We've made it to the one-on-one, a conversation where I get to break down news in sports with a key player in the industry. This week, I'm joined by Andrew Brandt, the executive director of the Jeffrey S. Moorad Center for the Study of Sports Law at Villanova University. Andrew is also a columnist at Sports Illustrated and The Athletic, a host of the Business of Sports podcast, and the former vice president for the Green Bay Packers. With this stacked roster, there's no one else I'd rather bring in to discuss the NFL than Andrew. Andrew, welcome to the show. One of the reasons why I love talking to you, as you know, is you've sort of sat across the table when it comes to the NFL as an agent, as a vice president with the Packers, and now in media, you sort of have your hands in everything. But given that experience, one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about is the NFL's ambitions of extending their regular season schedule to 18 games. Now, we know they expanded their schedule a few years ago to 17 games, and now there's rumors, not so quiet rumors, I would say, of expanding the schedule to 18 games. On your side, what goes into that negotiation between the players and the league itself?
Always great to be with you. And the issue is, you just pointed out, is there a negotiation to be had on this? It just seems like you just said it's not so much a secret. And Roger Goodell has been what I call kind of casual and almost nonchalant about it because it does require negotiation. It does require the players' buy-in. You mentioned 2020, the players gave away inventory, a 17th game for the first time ever. We now are in a 17-game season, and as you know, as everyone listening knows, we're never going back. We're never going to have a 16-game season again. The question is, when will we get to 18? The next collective bargaining agreement is 2030, 2031. And it's kind of assumed that, yeah, the Goodell and the owners will get their 18th game. When they got their 17th game, you know what they did next? They went to the networks. And the networks, armed with new inventory, gave them this historic contract of collective $110 billion. Networks probably want another game, and they're like, yeah, we'll get it. So the process is going to the union. Now, there are a lot of people, including players, that say, what did we get actually out of giving away that 17th game? And there you have to understand, what are they going to get actually for giving away an 18th game? If it's just an extra bye week, that's an easy give. It's just more time in the offseason. That's an easy give. I hope, for the players' sake, they get something tangible like real money, like loss of a franchise tag, like renewed commissioner discipline system, whatever it may be. But yes, it has to be negotiated with the players.
Yeah, Andrew, I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that's really interesting to me is it kind of feels like the new media rights deal where the NFL can opt out of it lines up sort of perfectly with the CBA expiring as well. I assume that was planned. What are your thoughts there?
I think when this was negotiated, Joe, you and I and all the pundits said, "Oh my God, $110 billion for 11 years for the NFL." But as we know, every week, the most predictable news every week is that another record on Fox, another record on CBS, another record on Amazon, another record on Monday Night Football. It just continues. The product escalates. The trajectory of the NFL is unstoppable, it seems. So yes, the owners will opt out, and 110 billion won't look like this incredible massive figure anymore just because of the popularity of the league. I think it's strategic. The owners have put in opt-outs before in collective bargaining negotiations that have worked well for the owners. The players don't have any opt-outs in this negotiation. So I think it is strategic. And yes, we're going to talk about a new TV deal or media deal along with a new player deal that will include, we're all expecting 18 games.
We've got to take a quick break, but we'll be back with more of my conversation with Andrew Brandt right after this. Welcome back to Yahoo Finance Sports Report. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano, and I'm here with Andrew Brandt. So we talked a little bit about, obviously, the 18th game, but a big portion of this feels like the international schedule as well. If you add an 18th game, all of a sudden it opens the door for teams to maybe make multiple trips overseas to play games each year, or at least one every year, right? Now, there's reports that that could be worth $1 billion to the league. And then to your point, it all of a sudden now feels like we're in this world where franchise valuations have gone up a lot over the last few years, but we may be looking at small numbers if that gets passed too.
Yeah, I mean, the carve outs have been amazing for a league that is able to print money. And again, my experience, I was in the first iteration overseas, as I've told you before, Joe, with the Barcelona Dragons, where, of course, it was different back then. They cheered at the wrong times. They did the wave the entire game long. But yes, London seemed like a streamlined way of getting in overseas in recent years. We talked about a London franchise with the Jaguars playing there twice a year. But you're right. I think what we're moving towards is not an international team and not an international conference, but an international schedule. And that schedule would be, let's start with 8 by next year, maybe the year after, where we have 8 games. That's 16 teams between London, Frankfurt, other places in Germany, Brazil, maybe Australia, Spain, etc. And then we'll get to 16 games, but 8 games will put every team over there every other year, competitively balanced. And one day it'll be 16 games every year, every team, 32 teams. But the key factor is what you mentioned. That is a carve out for media. So we have a carve out for the Christmas games. We have a carve out for Black Friday. We have a carve out for Thursday night football. We have a carve out for all these Peacock games. Now we'll have a carve out for international. It is printing money. And again, the owners are looking under every rock and cranny to find more revenue, and they just found one.
So you mentioned London, you mentioned Frankfurt, and they've had games in Mexico City. I think you mentioned Brazil as well. They're having a game in Spain at Real Madrid's new stadium. Is there anywhere else where you could see them expanding into over the next few years?
I've heard Australia, and I think obviously there's some challenges with the time zone and how to broadcast it here at a reasonable time. I just keep hearing that because, again, what they're looking for is not so much can we put a game there, but it's like, can we gain a foothold into the market? So if they can gain a foothold into the Australian market, into the Pan-Asian market, whether that's China, Japan, somewhere else. This is what we're talking about because basketball is more popular internationally. Obviously, soccer is. American football is the rage in America, but can it be pushed out further into other borders? That's really the goal. As much revenue we're talking about in this conversation, it's primarily domestic revenue. So can the NFL expand the way the NBA has in terms of international revenue?
Yeah, it really is amazing. People ask me all the time about the different leagues, and they always assume that the EPL or the Premier League is kind of the biggest and the baddest because of the global audience. But the NFL makes more money than any of those leagues, essentially combined, right? If you took the world's top 5 soccer leagues, the NFL makes more in a given year than them. And to your point, it's all domestic. So if they're able to figure out some kind of international strategy that's actually lucrative rather than just this kind of like one-off game here and there, it's going to be incredibly valuable for them as well. Andrew, one of the other things I wanted to get your opinion on, given your unique experiences, I read this article in ESPN a few weeks ago at this point, and it was talking about insurance in the NFL. And I'm sure this is something that you dealt with when you were at the Packers and have certainly dealt with on the player side as well. The idea that some of these teams are taking out insurance and some might not be, and specifically on quarterbacks or pass rushers or people that have the big contracts. What was your general strategy and thought process around whether to take out insurance or not on these players?
Yeah, Joe, I've been asked about that article. Kaylin Kaler, who I used to work with at Sports Illustrated, wrote that and actually asked me for comment on it. And I gave her some background comments. Listen, it's probably not as big a deal as she made it out to be, but it does happen. Some teams are very into it. Let's try to break it down for you. Teams will do big contracts with players. They will then enter in insurance agreements for the player being the beneficiary, but the player signs off that the return would go back to the team and the team would get cap credit for any return premiums. The problem with insurance is most insurers will do PTD, permanent total disability. And that's a reasonable price to pay for PTD. I did it on some big contracts. PTD is what it says. You cannot play again. You're permanently disabled from playing again. You and I and every listener knows how often does that happen? Not very often. Once in a blue moon, you'll have a player that is permanently totally disabled from football. So those premiums, while very reasonable, rarely, if ever, pay off. Now we get into TTD, temporary total disability. which is basically paying for an injury that sidelines a player over a certain number of games per year. That's expensive, as you might expect. That's extremely expensive because football is 100% injury rate. And how are you going to insure for temporary games missed when every player misses games, plus deductibles, plus exclusions? I'm sure Tua's injury at the head injury when they did that contract this year was excluded. Prior knee injuries, prior ankle injuries, prior Achilles injuries, very tough to insure. So my point, I guess, Joe, is that yes, a lot of teams like the Packers did PTD just in case the extraordinary ever happened. TTD, frankly, I found not to be cost effective, and did it one or two contracts, some of the big quarterback or defensive end, like you said, contracts, but very rarely.
Yeah, so it might be the bigger name players because they make a ton of money, but in the end, it's really not exercised as much. So maybe it's not always worth the premium.
I think so. Now, they did mention in the article teams like the Browns and Eagles do a lot of players. They've decided through ownership that it's worth it. And I'm assuming that's TTD. And again, high premiums, that the payoff could happen, get a cap credit. Everybody's looking for an edge with the cap. But again, the cap credit's going to be maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the premiums are going to be tens of thousands of dollars at least, maybe hundreds of thousands. So it's a cost risk assessment. That's what every team goes through.
Yeah, I think really the premise of the article too was almost basing it off of Aaron Rodgers, which is like this super
Yeah.
unique case study, right? Where like obviously if you could go back in time, you would get insurance because not only was he out the entire year, but you would get this massive cap credit for the following year. Now, my response to that would be that that's kind of 1 in a million. And granted, his age, sure, but that was his first major injury where he sat out essentially a long period of time.
Yeah, and the Achilles would have to be excluded. No insurance company is going to insure on Aaron Rodgers' contract coming off an Achilles that at the time they didn't even know he'd play. But, he's had some other injuries, but could you insure the knee? Could you insure the shoulder? Could you insure an elbow injury? Sure. And yeah, the Jets chose not to do that.
Super interesting. And it's one of those things that many people don't think about, but it's part of the reason why I have this show as well. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me. I always enjoy talking to you.
Likewise, Joe, always a pleasure to talk to you.
The clock is winding down here, but we have just enough time for some final buzz. So I want to leave everyone with a fun story out of the NFL. The Athletic recently released a story chronicling the NFL's consumption of Uncrustables. Yes, the crustless PB&J sandwiches that we all enjoyed as kids. The Athletic says that Uncrustables have unseeded orange slices as the official halftime snack of the NFL, offering players an enjoyable and tasty mix of protein, carbs, and fat. In fact, The Athletic found that NFL teams are consuming somewhere between 3,600 and 4,300 Uncrustables per week. That's 700 pounds worth of Uncrustables eaten every week in the NFL. And when you add in training camps, that figure equates to at least 80,000 Uncrustables eaten annually by NFL teams. Now, The Athletic gave us a bunch of figures letting us know who's eating the most, with the Denver Broncos consuming the most at around 700 Uncrustables per week. But The Athletic also gave us some fun stats and facts about individual players and teams, letting us know that Brock Purdy ate one Uncrustable before last year's Super Bowl. Andy Reid, the head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs, offers the snack as reward for players. George Kittle, a tight end on the 49ers, eats 2 Uncrustables on flights to away games. And Travis Kelce says that he eats Uncrustables more than, quote, anything else in the world. Now, the J.M. Smucker Company is a massive enterprise, but maybe the NFL's rise in eating Uncrustables has helped the stock grow nearly 7% over the last 5 years. We're all out of time today, though, so it's officially game over for this week. That's all for this episode. Thank you so much to Andrew Brandt and all of you for joining us. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano. See you next week.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.